Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Good morning. Thank you for being here in person, and to everyone on our streaming on Facebook and on LinkedIn. Thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Patricia Campos Medina, and I serve as the Executive Director of the Worker Institute at the School of Industrial and Labor Relations at Cornell University. Since 1940, the ILR School has worked with policymakers, business and labor leaders, workers' justice organizations, non-for-profits, and community groups to improve the lives of workers. As the preeminent educational institution in the world focused on work, employment, and labor relations, we are dedicated to generating and disseminating knowledge that improves the lives of workers, transforms the future of work, and advances collective bargaining rights. That is why I am delighted that the Worker Institute is hosting the launch of this very important book today, The Future We Need, Organizing for a Better Democracy in the 21st Century, written by authors Sarita Gupta and Erica Smiley. Yes, ça deserves an applause. I am proud to say that both of them are graduates of a National Labor Leadership Institute, NILI. In a way, this is coming back home for both of you. And Erica and I were in the same cohort of NILI. So I got to learn so much from you, Erica, during that period. Sarita and Erica are grassroots organizers, visionary leaders who have engaged in the hard work of coalition building to create new strategies for building worker power. With this book, they seek to inspire other leaders to seek a new path forward to transform collective bargaining power, to match our modern economy and our diverse workforce. This event could not be possible without the support of the Lois Gray Innovation Initiative, funded by labor educator and pioneer Lois Gray, who believe in the power of women and grassroots leaders to create innovative solutions to the problems at work. We have many distinguished speakers today, but my role here is very simple, and is to introduce to you our Dean of the ILR School, Alex Colvin. Dean Alex Colvin, you can applaud for that. Dean Alex Colvin is a professor of conflict resolution at ILR and an associate member of the Cornell Law faculty. We at the Worker Institute are grateful for Dean Colvin's vision to elevate ILR and the Worker Institute's role in the workplace as a catalyst for ideas and for addressing issues of income inequality and the critical role that labor plays in advancing democracy at work and in our society. Thank you so much, Dean Colvin, for being here and helping us at this discussion.
Thank you, Patricia, and it's my pleasure to be here with you today for a very important event. We are launching this exciting new book, and I'm modeling it here a little bit, The Future We Need, Organizing for Better Democracy in the 21st Century. It's my pleasure to introduce the amazing panel we've got here today. I'll start off with our two distinguished authors of the book. First off, Erica Smiley, who is the Executive Director of Jobs with Justice. She's a longtime organizer and movement leader who's spearheaded strategic organizing and policy interventions for Jobs with Justice for nearly 15 years. Prior to taking her current position with the organization, she was organizing director for Jobs with Justice, developing campaigns that resulted in transformational changes to how working people organize and are critically engaged in their workplaces and in their communities. Prior to joining Jobs with Justice, she organized with community groups and unions such as the Tenants and Worker Support Committee in Virginia and SEIU Local 500 in Baltimore. Though her career in social and economic justice began in the reproductive justice field, serving as National Field Director for Choice USA. And I think we've all been kind of reminded recently of the links between organizing in these domains. We're proud to count her as one of the Neely alumni and welcoming her back to ILR. And it's also my pleasure to introduce the second author of the book, Sarita Gupta, Vice President of U.S. Programs at the Ford Foundation, where she oversees the foundation's domestic work, including civic engagement in government, creativity and free expression, future of workers, technology and society, disability rights, and gender, racial, and ethnic justice. She joined the That's a lot. It's a big ambit. She previously served as executive director of Jobs with Justice, where she was a leader in the fight for workers' rights, shaping the public discourse on every front to build power for working people and creating an economy that benefits everyone. And she's been on the front lines of organizing and policy campaigns to boost wages, worker voice, and working conditions for all working people and improve labor and civil rights. She's also co-director of Caring Across Generations, a national movement transforming the way America defines care so all families can live well and age with dignity. And we're also proud to count her as one of our Neely alumni. And welcome back to the Now, after we hear from our two authors, we're going to hear from two amazing discussants who are going to talk about the book, and I'm going to introduce them now. First off, Liz Schuler, president of the Afl-Cio, who's joining us online. Well, no, this is the Peak National Federation for Unions in America, a federation of 57 unions, 12.5 million workers who are members of Afl-Cio unions. She's a visionary leader and longtime trade unionist who believes that the labor movement is the single most powerful vehicle for progress. The unions are a central force in leading lasting societal transformation. She's committed to busting myths about labor, leveraging the labor movement's diversity for innovative approaches to social justice, and making the benefits of a union voice of the job available to working people everywhere. A longtime friend of ours, and also glad to have her with us again today. And our second discussant, Sherry Davis, who is Associate Director with the Center for Innovation Worker Organization and also an Assistant Professor for Professional Practice with the Labor Studies and Employment Relations Department in the School of Management and Labor Relations at Rutgers University. Prior to coming to Rutgers, she was Director for the West Side Communities Alliance at the Ivan Allen College of Liberal Arts at Georgia Tech. She's also leading a global transformational leadership project surveying the needs of non-traditional leaders in worker justice organizations, focus on their development process and support network. Always a pleasure to have one of our faculty from one of our sister institutions with us, joining us here. So thank you for joining us today. So the way we're going to work is I'm going to give each of our authors 5 minutes to talk about the book, and then I'll turn over to our discussants. First Liz Schuler, and then Sherry Davis, each for 10 minutes for comments. And then we're going to go to some general discussion. There's going to be some Q&A. So we'll do both people in the room in good hybrid fashion. I see we have about 69 participants online. So online participants, get ready to put in Q&A questions in the Q&A when we get to that part of it, and we'll try and answer those too and have a robust hybrid discussion going on. So I'm going to turn it over to our authors next, though, to kick things off. Erica, you ready to go first? Okay.
Thank you so much, Dean. Holy cow, it's so nice to be here. I got to tell you, I haven't seen some of you since the before times, and just really thank you, Patricia, thank you, Kim, and Cornell for hosting us and hosting us this morning. And of course, to all of you on Zoom, particularly Liz, and I even saw some folks zooming in from Texas. So just really excited to have you all here. I don't think our book would have been possible without many of you, both in this room and on the screen. I'll just open up briefly and say that, it's interesting. I don't think I realized how important it was for me to write this book and be a part of this with Sarita until after it came out, after we've been through the process. And it's still a bit of a process, I'll be honest. We won't go into the details. But it's been a real journey. And, when I finally held it in my hands, I really felt, a kind of pride and validation, and like I kind of committed one of the purposes I needed to commit in life for my own ancestors. I'm from North Carolina, and I didn't grow up amongst a union family. North Carolina is one of the lowest, if not the lowest, union density in the country. Maybe we go back and forth with Puerto Rico. It depends on who you ask. But in any case, I didn't know what a union was. And yet, one of my first moments of being activated was with a set of workers. I just knew them as women, Black women who worked at Kmart, some of whom went to our church, who were facing some discrimination. And I was just one of the young people in one of the many churches who answered the call. And, through that process, again, I didn't learn until much later that they were trying to organize a contract with Act-Cio, but I did learn that collective action got the goods, and they won. And I realized coming into the movement as I got older that it wasn't so much that we need to try to build a powerful labor movement just among people who already had access to 20th century mechanisms for organizing collective bargaining, but that we needed to build a movement that the people I grew up around, people like those Kmart women, people like the youth in the churches that answered the call, could be a part of it. And that in many ways, as a Southerner and as a Black person, to see this fight not simply as one of workers' rights, but to see it as one of democracy. And in fact, when we look at the workers in the streets today, whether it's the Amazon workers waiting on the boat in Staten Island, or even waiting on the challenges in Alabama, and when we see the Starbucks workers stepping out, and workers at Apple and workers at REI, it's important to see these fights not simply as workers standing up for themselves. They are standing up for better standards and conditions, but actually to see them on as kind of the front lines, almost like the Marines or the vanguard of democracy. In fact, I like to equate what many have called the Great Resignation to what W.B. Du Bois once referred to as the largest strike in American history, when 500,000 formerly enslaved Black people simply walked off the plantations. And that, of course, required, it wasn't just a spontaneous action, and it required movement to actually then translate that into what we now know of as the Reconstruction Amendments, right, to abolish slavery, in the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, which defined citizenship, 15th, which started to define who could vote. And that's actually one of the last periods in American history where we're all kind of facing in the same direction to kind of actualize this promise of a multiracial democracy, imperfect though it was, right? And our movements over the last 150 plus years have been trying to expand on that promise and to make it real. And of course, our opposition has been trying to roll it back in some instances to pre-Civil War terms. And so it's important to see the actions of workers today through that lens, through the lens of being, in essence, the front line of democracy. And so that's the lane that we decided to write this book in, to really expand on this idea that democracy is not just a political practice, but it's something that has to also happen economically. If we consider democracy to be something beyond just voting once or twice a year, then we have to also understand that what it means is everyday people governing themselves in all walks of life, from the civic engagement to their economic lives to otherwise. And that requires a platform to do that. And in the US, collective bargaining has been one of the main paths through which everyday people could govern themselves, to set enforceable agreements, to grieve things when they're wrong, to change things when conditions change. There's a reason why unions have historically been called schools of democracy. And so we're in a moment now that I think we have a pretty profound opportunity. Certainly in the book, we lift up some case studies and we talk about this not just through the sense of the historic nature, but really lift up live campaigns, including some which recently won. And I want to just close with this, and before I pass it to Sarita, I felt really validated on April 1st in a way that I shouldn't say I didn't expect to. It was more just it was a welcome surprise. On April 1st, two things happened. So the first one, all of you probably know very well, which is because the Staten Island workers, the independent Amazon labor union, won their election at Amazon. And they, along with the Amazon committee, along with workers around the country who were organized with different groups, different unions, were activated in large part because of the Black Lives Matter movement. Were activated after the murder of George Floyd, and said that, how is it that we're essential? We're in this pandemic, we're operating in this new world, and yet you aren't giving us basic PPE, you aren't giving us basic supplies, you're arresting us in the plant in Bessemer that's 85% Black, you're hyper using police surveillance, right, to surveil the workers, right? And thank you for the research, Tammy, who's here. And so they said, you know what, this is our Black Lives Movement. And this is where it's important for us as movement people to know both what motivates leaders into action, but also what wins, right? Because then they won. Well, what the unknown story is on that same day, because this one only got press in The Guardian, but it was equally important, and we had lifted it up in our book, is a case of garment workers in Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, who have been trying to negotiate with a set of multinational brands, unheard of. What global bargaining agreements do we know of, right? And what's interesting is that their leaders, their presidents of most of their unions, multi-country, had been men. And, they had been in there with the good fight, fighting for better wages and an Asia floor wage. And we've been supporting that for decades at Jobs with Justice. But the women members were like, look, we want better wages too. But the thing that we're really freaked out about right now is the gender-based violence we're experiencing on work sites from the managers. Like we're literally being locked in, we're being harassed, like we're being assaulted. In fact, there was a worker who had passed away in Tamil Nadu, Jasari, who was killed by a manager. And so they started their own committee within the unions, a women's committee, and a campaign on gender-based violence. Well, lo and behold, all of a sudden the brands who wouldn't answer the call, all of a sudden started answering the call. In fact, they started showing up to the table to negotiate. And through that strategy, those workers were actually able to sign the first global brand bargaining agreement across multiple countries with both H&M, the Gap signed on recently, which has never signed on to anything. This is why we say in the book, and why we say that the fight, centering the fights against white supremacy, centering the fights against gender injustice and patriarchy, is not simply something to do because it's the right thing to do. It is, but it actually is the key to winning. And not doing so will almost guarantee our defeat. And so, as two women, and particularly two women of color who didn't necessarily come from the traditional union families or the traditional union locations, we wanted to write a book that wasn't just about our personal stories. We wanted to include that, but we wanted to actually write something that was through the lens of us and through the lens of workers, that was an articulation of what we felt should be done. That was an articulation of strategy, not just an articulation of my story or my struggle. And so in essence, that's also the intervention we hope that you'll get from reading the book.
Would it be okay if we're just going to do a little audible on the order, just because
Sure.
I know President Schuler
I want to hear
has to
from
go
Liz.
11:30. So let's go to her next, then we'll go back and forth. That'll actually work perfectly. So that'll be nice. So
Absolutely.
President Schuler, do you want to make your comments now?
Sure. Well, good morning, everyone. And I just wanted to say I'm having a bit of FOMO, fear of missing out, because I see everyone in the room and you're hugging and it's so exciting. And I really wanted to be there in person. So I'm so sorry that I have to be on Zoom. Not ideal, but here we are. But this is an amazing new book. I just want to say thanks, of course, to Dean Colvin for bringing us together, and a special shout out to my friend Patricia Campos Medina as well, the entire Cornell ILR Worker Institute team. I had to be here virtually. I just said, I must be included in this because I want to uplift these two incredible leaders. And just how their brilliant ideas have impacted our labor movement and the workers' movement that we are seeing now. This has been a long time in the making, and this book really captures in one place all the phenomenal work and the thinking that you've been incubating for years. So I just want to say thank you off the top, because I'm so honored to be included, first of all. Next, I just have to say, piling on to what Smiley said, is just everyone is talking about this moment for workers, and that this is the book that we need in this moment, because there is a groundswell around the power of collective action. And we're all pinching ourselves because we know it's been building for a really long time, but everyone else is now seeing it. It's water cooler talk. I mean, is there even a water cooler anymore? I don't know, but it's in our Facebook feeds, our Twitter feeds, it's on our cups at Starbucks, right? All these people, we're all named Union at Yes now, right? So everyone is watching, and it's because workers are fired up and they're in motion. And people are fed up, as Smiley was saying, this broken system, and I'm sure Sarita will be talking about this in a minute. We've been living in this for far too long. And I think in the book, you put it as executives and companies socializing responsibility and risk while privatizing profits at the top. And people are fired up okay? And they're finally seeing collective action and unions and coming together as the way to make change. And so I don't need to tell you about the Gallup poll and, you know, public support at 68%, highest in 50 years. And then this great resignation, or the big quit, as people are calling it, that we just did a deep dive, a study on why are people quitting? Well, it's because they're fed up with toxic environments and burnout and bad managers and bad customers. And they feel, on one hand, powerless, but on the other hand, starting to see, wait a second, I don't just have to take it anymore. And that collective action could solve their problems. So it's really an exciting time. The ground is fertile. But I think the point here of this convening and the book is that we need new innovative ideas and approaches more than ever. And we need to build on this groundswell and unleash, and this is my line, unleash unprecedented organizing in all its forms, in new industries, in new places. And I just think that, you know, the more we can innovate and modernize, the better. And that's what I've been obsessed with as far as our perch at the Afl-Cio. And, you know, modernizing the way we work together, for one. And I think about Bessemer, Alabama, and those heroic workers standing up with RWDSU. Just like I say, if Bessemer had taken place in New York City, there would be a second Amazon union with JFK 8 and ALU. But we, for the first time ever, brought 15 different unions across sectors, and there were over 100 organizers in Bessemer on the ground helping each other, kind of pulling the curtain back to share strategies with each other. That's one example that I can throw out there on modernizing. It's the vertical that we created in places like Seattle, where we developed a digital hiring hall that is centered around stadium work, but is using a platform approach to bring workers in from communities who've historically been marginalized and wondering, how do I get those jobs? Well, you do it through the Central Labor Council and the Digital Hiring Hall that brings unions and community together in a new way. You know, expanding in new industries like the offshore wind industry. I love to hold up the example where we come together across a sector, right? And with a high road employer from Europe, that we can actually build a framework agreement because we all want high road, high wage jobs. And whether it's Apple stores or museum workers, I mean, these are investments where, you know, workers are playing the front and center role, and unions are lifting up the wind beneath their wings. And so I think we just need more, and this is what the book catalogs or is catalyzing, that we need more ways to fight back in disruptive ways in places where workers have limited rights under the law, because we know so many people are left out of the law, and then also state law limits our ability to come together. So I think back before the pandemic about the Red for Ed movement, where teachers in West Virginia used a work stoppage to advocate for change. And they were even ahead of their own union, right? It was like, we're going out, we're fed up, we're fired up. And then the union even woke up and was like, wow, okay, this is power. And so it's kind of dusting ourselves off and, you know, building that muscle up in new and creative ways, that the pandemic has even lit a fire under even more. And so that's coming out of the pandemic. We're going to have to look at new industries and new technologies. I just wanted to put a pin in that, and I know you speak to it in the book, that the pandemic hastened the use of technology in the workplace. And we need to make sure that workers are at the center of that, you know, that process of using new technologies in the workplace. But we need to be co-creating and co-designing so that workers are actually not displaced. We're enabling workers to create a new path to even better jobs. And so we're going to be organizing in new ways in those industries as they evolve and as technology takes hold. But so I just wanted to say thank you again. To me, the most powerful part of the book was the storytelling, and we talk about, you know, how we need to have workers front and center telling their stories. It's the most powerful tool, and everyone's story is different. Every community's story is different, and I particularly loved reading the authors' stories, which Erica, I will just say that your story resonated with me, because I think in the labor movement, often we think you have to come up a certain way to have credibility, or, you know, if you're not from a union and you're from community organizing, that your organizing is different. This is not true. And that's one thing that I think a modern labor movement really can put forward, is that this is going to take everyone's talents in all kinds of different ways to build this movement for the moment, and looking at the big picture. And so whether you're, you know, a care worker, as Betty was talking about, you know, caring for her aging parents, and trying to, you know, and I think it was her son that had autism, right? That is working at McDonald's, you know, trying to make it. You know, whether it is, you know, a worker that is working to reform immigration policy. I think it was Lydia who was talking about the big picture and what that means to rebuild the economy. So this notion of worker storytelling to humanize the systemic fault lines that we see in our economy, and how we come together to rebuild this future where we can all prosper. So thank you so much for the work. This book is powerful, and we want to uplift it wherever we go, and be partners in getting this message out far and wide. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz.
Thank you, Liz.
Great. Thank you so much for your comments, and I really appreciate that you're able to join us here today. Going to turn over to Sarita now to talk a little bit more about the book.
Absolutely. Thank you. And Liz, thank you so much for those comments. And I just, before you leave, I just want to say it feels so amazing to see a woman leader leading the labor movement right now. It makes me really emotional, and it's about time. And I just, congratulations, and thank you for all of your leadership in this moment. And thank you, Dean Colvin and Patricia and Kim and everyone at ILR for inviting us and hosting us today. And so grateful for Cherie to be here with us, who's been on this journey writing with us as well. So I'm just going to briefly build on some of what Smiley has already offered as some of the core messages of our book. But I am going to begin also with just sharing a little bit of my own story. I too did not grow up in a union household. My family immigrated to Rochester, New York, otherwise known as Kodak City, when immigration doors opened up because there was a need for foreign medical graduates to come and provide healthcare in rural communities. And so my family ended up in Rochester, and I grew up actually one town over from Kodak Park, which was the industrial park of Kodak. And the truth is, my experience growing up there in a working class community where the majority of the kids I was growing up with had family members who had worked for generations at Kodak, really shaped my thinking around unions, dignity, and agency. And really because throughout my childhood, I was literally in elementary school when the first wave of downsizing began in my community. And I watched and experienced the devastating impacts as more and more of my family, my friends of my family, friends and families were losing jobs or were able to find new jobs, but that jobs that weren't paying as well, that were not going to give them the benefits nor the ability to sustain themselves in a middle-class lifestyle that they had. So the impact was just devastating. And I remember the 10-year-old me being confused by this and wondering, how is it possible that so many people that I know could have worked for multiple generations for a company and feel like overnight that that work is gone and the financial security is gone for so many people, and have no say in what the new economy could look like. For many of my friends and families, they felt left behind, quite literally. And the truth is, we see a lot of divisions in America today, right? Growing anger and frustration. People feel left behind by employers, by policymakers, and frankly, by our movements too, right? They've lost faith in our democracy, and they've lost faith in the role of government. And the truth is that when I talk to friends, but also I follow them on Facebook feeds, right? I'm aging myself on Facebook feed, watching. The truth is, some of the kids I grew up with, they were in DC on January 6th. They were protesting the elections. They are angry. They feel, like I said, left behind. They feel a lack of dignity, respect, and agency. And that is a big reason, but a really big reason why I was compelled to write this book, that we needed to really understand the economic pain points that people are experiencing and weave it back into our understanding of democracy. The democracy isn't just about political voice. That is critical. And let's be clear, we're fighting that battle, right? But it is also about democracy in the context of their economic well-being and ability to exercise democratic practice in all of their economic relationships. And that is actually what led Smiley and I to write this book. It has been said that for years, the two of us had the opportunity to work at Jobs of Justice. We had the privilege of working right at the intersections of unions, worker centers, student movements, community-based organizations, faith movements. And through that, we got to shape and support innovative strategies and tactics. But we realized that there was no coherence to the story of the labor movement. That's been evolving over the last 2 decades. And I think Liz said that so beautifully. Like we kind of followed, there's a victory here and a struggle here and a struggle here, but there was no story about how all of those struggles actually add up to more than the sum of their parts and actually forge the pathway for the future we need. And that's really why we wrote this book. So another core message, in addition to what Smiley has already laid out, that I want to lift up is the need to modernize bargaining as we know it. Business, finance, and the economy have complexified over the last century and continue to globalize and fissure, all of which has eroded workers' rights and our public institutions. Our labor and social justice responses and how we organize also needs to adjust to effectively combat them. So in the book, we talk a lot about the need to expand how we think about bargaining, that we know we need to forge new ways of organizing. And this speaks to the call that Liz just made about we need more innovations, right? We need to forge new ways of organizing and bargaining appropriate to a world in which power is concentrating in the hands of a few economic actors. We need to assert, and we do assert in the book, that collective bargaining not only affects workers in their workplaces, but beyond work sites as well. Workers really have a stake in their ability to come together collectively, not only as employees, but also in the myriad of other ways that working people interact with the economy as tenants, debtors, homeowners, and consumers, and more. Therefore, we believe that we have to expand our definition of bargaining to be about creating the pathways for working people to come together collectively with any entity that has power over their lives and be able to negotiate an agreement. This approach of expanded bargaining ensures democratic practices are applied to all the ways that workers interact with the economy. This also helps us recognize that collective bargaining is a fundamental characteristic of democracy, right? So part 3 of our book, The Way We Win, outlines 3 approaches that can shift the nature of what a union contract covers and broadens what individuals can negotiate over and who they can negotiate with, from the direct boss to the individuals with concentrated power in their sector or in their community. So I won't go into tons of details because we want to get into discussions, but just to lift up the three approaches that we outline. One is about expanding the frameworks beyond employers. So this for us is bargaining with the real decision makers, the ultimate profiteers. And we use examples like garment workers, as Smiley just talked about, or agricultural workers. And there's numerous examples in the book we lift up of how this is happening. The second is using traditional bargaining to raise issues broader than what is permissible topics at the table. And this is bargaining, like really seeing bargaining as a site of struggle. And we lift up bargaining for the common good as examples of this kind of really powerful work that is in motion. And finally, applying frameworks of bargaining to other economic relationships. And that is what we reference as community-driven bargaining, negotiating beyond the workplace. And we lift up examples like the Crown Heights Tenants Union to domestic workers and the care economy as examples of this. At the end of the day, we are clear that workers are not waiting for laws to change. And therefore, as we get into discussion, we can share more of what that has translated into in terms of the moment we're in. And one last element of the book that I want to lift up is what Smiley referenced and Liz has referenced, which is the stories of workers and worker leaders. We wanted to design a storytelling component that wasn't just about workers talking about the problems that they were facing, but to see them as strategists, as leaders in their workplaces, as leaders who could tell us what it felt like, not just how they did it, but what it felt like, heart, right? What it felt like to join with their peers in their workplace, how it fundamentally transformed them as human beings, as leaders in our society, and the lessons that they've learned as they led these struggles, and most importantly, the stories of themselves as the whole people that they are. Workers are not just workers, right? We are multidimensional people. And being able to hear the stories of the real many aspects that have shaped who they are and led them to lead in the way they do. And the portraits were another way for us to really visualize who these leaders are. And we felt that was important because, first of all, how many of us walk into museums and buildings and see these massive portraits? And mostly they're men, no offense to the men in the room. We don't really lift up the leaders who are at the forefront of our struggles. So one, we wanted them to have portraits of themselves. Second, that it's really important culturally. In this moment, we are in a powerful cultural moment. The narrative is shifting, right? We have to change the perception of who we think is a worker, who we see as leaders, and recognize, frankly, as you see in the cover, it takes workers of all colors and backgrounds to build the multiracial feminist democracy that we need in this society. And that was really important for us to do. And all of these stories and everything I just talked about helped us get at the real so what of the book, which is, at the fundamentally, Smiley and I wrote this book because we are in a moment of great transformation. We have the opportunity right now, and I do think it's a once in a generation opportunity to shape the future that we need, one in which workers can live and work with dignity, that they can have agency, and as Smiley and I like to say, dare we say it, they can live joyful lives, because this is fundamentally about people being able to live joyful lives. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, thanks so much for those remarks. Now I'm going to turn over to Shireen for her reaction.
If you can adjust to the fact that Sarita finally got me to say love.
Yes. Yes. Love is a strategy. So first off, I want to say it's really great to be in person and talking to people who I can actually reach out and touch afterwards, and to also be on a panel with the folks that I admire most. And I first want to also bring kind of greetings on behalf of our Dean of the School of Management and Labor Relations, Adrian Eaton, as well as Marilyn Snyderman, who is the Executive Director of CWEL, Center for Innovation and Worker Organization, and all of our team. Again, it is really a privilege to be able to be here, and I have been anxiously waiting for this book. The first thing I do want to turn to, though, is the importance of talking about the kind of text that we have. I have spent the last few years that I've kind of come back into labor talking about why we should be centering intersectionality, understanding what it is, and recognizing it as a labor story and a labor struggle. I was first introduced to Kimberly Crenshaw's work, Demarginalizing the Intersections of Race and Sex, through a women's studies program, right? And so my coming to labor was through Black feminism, through the Combahee River Collective. And so Black feminism leads me to Ohio State University, right? Jobs with Justice into labor. Unlike you all, I did grow up in a labor household. I didn't know it. My father was UAW my entire life. We had vacations, we had health insurance. You know, I knew that I was going to college when I was in kindergarten because my dad made a deal, right, in kindergarten, and he prepared and knew that he would have job security, the idea that he was going to be able to do that for me and for my brother and sister. And so there is a particular way that I came up through labor, but had no understanding of what it was until I get to Ohio State and I see all of these Black women who look like my grandmother basically saying that they're being paid worse than folks who had just started a job at McDonald's and they've been at the university for 30 years. And so that for me was a aha moment because I'm in a women's studies program and our entire department said, we are not having this. And we had a strike that lasted for 30 days, right? And literally shut down the campus. And this is all because we actually had support. Jobs with Justice had a new person, Treston Davis Faulkner, who was the new Student Labor Action Project coordinator and was invited to campus. And he basically taught students and workers how to talk to each other, how to operate within our power, and how to win. Set up the table, sign the cards, the pledge cards. I'll be there 5 times a year for someone else's struggle as well as my own. I was sold, right? But the thing that really mattered in that for me is that I understood that intersectionality and this particular way that I thought about Black feminism could be put into practice through labor, right? I saw what happened when folks got together and demanded and could win. And that again brings me to actually talking about, again, how we have to have a certain kind of text that helps us to be able to see and make these connections. Of course, she's from Georgia. I'm from Georgia, you know, and that feeling of being, you know, she was from up north and she's down on campus and she's trying to figure out why things are not working out and why even these unemployment benefits are going away. That's the feeling I had coming back from DC when I went to school at Emory, and I had just been negotiating contracts with workers where we were getting, you know, $18, $19, $20 an hour for janitors. And then I come to Emory and they're barely making anything. And I was like, I'm never going to get this degree because I'm going to come out here and have to organize all the workers. But the reason why I say that is because it is because of these stories, like names and faces of particular people that I can list throughout my journey who I've seen basically take a union contract and turn it into like magic. I've seen folks who would be considered to be powerless read management for filth, right? Like just flat out like a messed up contract where they could turn to page 35 and basically say, you can't do this and this is why, and this is what we're gonna do if you have the audacity to do it. And I don't think we hear those stories enough, right? There's certain ones of us who do this work for those shop stewards, right? For those worker leaders who are willing to actually do something extraordinary, but they're ordinary folks.
Yeah.
And for me reading the text, I think the argument that we've been making within labor, and I say we because my colleagues Tammy Lee and Naomi R. Williams are here, is that if we told the stories the way that you all do in the text, we would actually have our schools filled with folks who recognize and understand and see themselves in this.
Mhm.
It took a Jobs with Justice and a strike at Ohio State for me to understand that I came from a labor family and that meant what that meant, right, for me. But we don't always get an opportunity to see that. I never imagined when I worked at the Afl-Cio 20 years ago that we would have a Liz Schuler. And quite frankly, I never imagined that in the time that I knew you all when we were younger, that you all would actually be such influential labor leaders, right? Like women of color, being able to actually shape and shift the way that we think about who is labor, think about who are leaders, and think about the strategies, right, that we employ to be able to win.
Mhm.
And so for me, I think, you know, I'm going to be teaching the book in the fall. And our class is called Women Take the Lead, Race, Gender, and
Nice.
Labor.
Love it.
So we're excited about that. And to be clear, that is part of the Advancing Black Strategists Initiative that comes, right? Exactly. I know that you all plotted and planned for this to happen, but the point is that you've given us the text that we need to be able to help people see themselves in this movement, but also not like they have to shed the other movements that they're a part of in order to do it, right? Again, I come through Black feminism. Labor is legible to me because it is praxis. Then put those stories into a context, a historical context, a political context, that make the stories make sense, but also illuminate what the problems are and allow the folks who are identifying what the problems are to be a part of the remedy, to be a part of the repair. And then we take action. And after we take action, we see what that action did. Did it bring in more people, right? Did they sign the pledge card? Are they coming to the next rally? Are they coming to the next action or whatever the case may be? Yeah. And when they do come, we're going to invite them into the room too, because something connected for them. And because it connected for them, we need to hear their stories too and why that's happening. That's theory making, that's praxis. And again, when we do the scholarship in that way, that we don't take people's stories, extract them, and then make them bullet points underneath the ideas that we already had and have shared for 20, 30 years, multiple decades. But when we actually listen to these stories and allow them to illuminate what these systems are like, what it feels like to live in these particular conditions, and you know that it is because the multiple oppressions that you are experiencing all at the same time, simultaneously. When you literally sit with somebody who is explaining to you all of these things, and I think that's important because I think with Kimberly, there's so much detail with Kimberly in DC, right? And at a certain point, you're like, wow, this is a lot of detail. But the point is actually that detail actually matters, right? Like when we ask the question of, do you know what's going on inside of like workers' bodies, and not just like as workers, but like what's happening in the interior of their lives? We don't often get in a case study that information, right? That is the stuff that's left on the side, on the chopping block. But when you put that in there, you allow for so many people to say, I was taking care of my mom. That thing happened to me in school. That thing, and you give people a doorway in. And that is really what, for me, this text does. And it also appreciates the fact that all of us don't come up with a labor history. Like I'm in a labor studies department and people will say certain things and I'm like, yeah, I have no idea what you're talking about because I did not study that. That is not how I came here to this movement. But you introduce it in a way that respects the reader, but is also accessible. It is written in such a way that you want people to know about how the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment are setting us up and how it's a project that we want to live into. Yeah. You give us the information around these labor laws that lovingly actually make it okay for me to read. You take the thing that I'm writing in the margins and you put it in the main text. Usually I'm reading labor text and I'm like, but y'all don't want to talk about white supremacy though. But y'all don't want to talk about patriarchy. Oh, but what about this? Oh, but y'all left these people out. You know, I spend all this time in the margins if you're looking at my, but y'all took the conversation in the back of the room and you put it in the front of the room. You put it in the center of the text and you cite your citations, your politics of citations, and naming the people who have been trying to tell us this stuff for a long time. You are actually giving shine to them and you're giving shine to everyday workers. And that, quite frankly, is the blueprint for how we need to be doing our labor studies programs. And it is also the blueprint for how we bring people into these movements to win. And so I just really want to say thank you to both of you.
Thank you. That was amazing. Thank you.
Right, like a transcript of that?
I believe we will have a recording, so we'll be able to check that's the magic of the recordings. Thanks to those comments, really fantastic, inspiring comments. We're going to start a discussion going now. We're going to take questions from the audience and online. So I see a couple already going to the Q&A, so keep putting those in. I'm going to chuck one out just to kind of get our conversation started. One of the realities of writing a book is at a certain point, you have to say, okay, this is the end of the time. I can't keep talking about the latest things happening. I got to finish the book. I'm sure you ran into that. The worst part of yes. But this has been a pretty exciting year for labor. We had the strike wave, Strike October last fall. We've had the Amazon and Starbucks organizing. Reading the book, I was thinking about that because, we've seen this now, and I'm thinking about, what you're talking about in the book in relation to that. I'd be really curious to hear what you think about this latest wave of organizing in light of what you've written in the book and you're thinking about this. So I just want to chuck that out. Any thoughts on that?
I'm happy to kick us off. Smiley made some reference to this a bit earlier, but there's been so much talk of this moment being about the Great Resignation, and we've really tried to counter that narrative and say it really is a great awakening, that we are in a moment when so many working people across the economy, that's really key, across the economy, are saying enough. Like I actually should have a voice. In my workplace, I should have better working conditions. How come companies are profiting and doing so well, and I'm not getting any portion of that? Those profits. Why am I not feeling like I'm gaining? There's actually this amazing podcast this morning on the Daily about this. If you have not listened to it, but it was just this incredible moment, this confluence, I think, that we're seeing of workers feeling emboldened, of an economy in which the pandemic really was a traumatic event for all of us, right? And especially for workers on the front lines who really have understood that the way things have always been do not have to be the way things need to be because they weren't working in the first place. Right. And that awareness is what really gives me a lot of optimism and hope right now in all the ways that Liz also talked about. Like, we are seeing so many workers in motion because of that. And it's important that we're also recognize that more and more everyday people, again, across the economy, across race and gender, are actually seeing themselves as workers. They're actually identifying as workers, which I remember. I'm looking at Erin Johansson from Jobs of Justice. Years ago, we did this research, and the first thing we found out was workers don't identify as workers. So how do you talk about workers' rights with them if they don't see themselves in the story, which is a lot of what motivated us.
And I thought bargaining was like a deal at the dollar.
Exactly. They didn't like the bargaining language. It was about negotiating, but not bargaining. Anyway, all of that to say, I think we're in a really incredible moment, but we have to be really smart about how to channel this moment into the kinds of around how we build lasting power, how we build lasting institutions and organizations that really can carry forward the ongoing hard work that we know workers will have to endure to both negotiate for better working conditions, but also to see that their voice doesn't have to begin and end in the work site, but it actually extends. And in the book, we have many examples of the transformations that people go through, including Dolores Wright, who is an amazing leader of Domestic Workers United. And she tells, actually when Smiley and I went to talk to her, it was actually about her role in the Crown Heights Tenants Union. And so we were fascinated by what she was doing, and then came to find out she'd been a major leader as a domestic workers at Domestic Workers United and won the Bill of Rights. And she had this moment of like, if I can do this in this realm, why can't I do this in this realm? That's the opportunity we have right now.
One of my favorite parts is how we discovered that was happening too. I think it wasn't even until we were listening back to her recording and her transcript, and she said, yes, I was, having lunch with some of the other nannies, and this Asian woman walked past and was passing out leaflets, and we said, but is she talking about IJIN? That's a different perspective. I'll just add two things to what Sarita said, because I think she summarized it pretty well. The first is that, and Liz kind of alluded to this, we kind of intentionally blurred the lines between organizer and leader. And there's, long-standing organizing tradition that's like, you're a staff organizer, you're a leader, and you're, you support the leaders, but you do the strategy. And we were like, well, it's not how some of the best strategies work at all. And in fact, wanted to make sure that, like Sarita said, we lifted up workers as the strategists and vice versa. And then the second thing is that, I mentioned coming from North Carolina. Liz talked about the workers in Alabama, and she also referenced the teachers in West Virginia in 2018. And one of the things I like to draw up in that book, because that's one of the stories as well, is that the teachers who first walked out, who first took courageous action to leave school and drive to Charleston, they were in the 3 counties in the bottom of the state, Mingo, Wyoming, and I can't remember the third one. I always blow it. But nevertheless, you would think that those would be like the most radical left vanguard counties in the state. And in fact, when you look at a political map, they're the most conservative, most consistently conservative through the political landscape. And so how is this? How could this be? How could teachers in the most conservative counties of West Virginia be the first to step out, even against the maybe the leadership's desires? Or how can a young kid from North Carolina or from Georgia grow up and be leads in the labor movement? And I realized a couple of things. One is similar to what Cherie said, that many of our people and many of the movements and struggles that we know are actually labor struggles. They just haven't necessarily been described that way historically. Even when you look at the March on Washington and people talk about it as civil rights, I mean, it was about jobs and economic rights. I mean, a lot of the organizing that came out of the 70s and 80s was anchored in laws passed in the Civil Rights Act. But the other thing that we realized that we lifted up in the book that felt really important was this idea of a new map. That for organizers, we needed to think about not simply what the last president was that any state or county went to, but is that me? Okay, something's up. Okay, that's me making crazy sound. Okay, sorry, I don't know. I don't know what it looks like on it. I have no idea how that translated on the Zoom, but it wasn't my stomach; it was my mic. Okay, so all I'll say to wrap this up is that we wanted to look at the country through the lens of a new map, to think about the relationship between mechanisms for bargaining. And what we found was that instead of just knowing like blue states versus red states and kind of maybe missing the ball on opportunities, what we found was that people in states that had long lost, if they ever had access to 20th century practices for democracy, whether that's voting or bargaining, organizing, collective bargaining, they had so much more of an appetite for what was possible beyond just trying to be included in something, beyond just being trying to get back to some lost way of doing things. There's an appetite for building something new, something that perhaps we've been promised but have never actually seen before. And so I like to think of that when I go back and know that the latest Amazon committee that came online is from North Carolina, to know that the Starbucks workers in Boone just organized and won their election, to see the Alabama workers at Bessemer have an election that's too close to call, and them doing their own solidarity with workers in the Starbucks in Birmingham. Then it makes sense to see that the most militant base of the labor movement is actually anchored in the southern region, always has been. And so why would we leave that power on the table?
One of the things that I think I will use the microphone.
Okay.
One of the things that I also think is really beautiful about what we're seeing in the South is that worker centers and unions are working together. Like folks are seeing all of these struggles as collective. And so you hear about organizers coming from multiple organizations working together to be able to like see a larger victory, right? And I do think that sometimes, you know, people talk about the silos of like, well, community-based orgs who focus on worker well-being and over here, and worker centers are different because they're more culturally relevant and they're focused over here. And then the unions here is very different. They have a particular kind of structure. But the reality of it is actually when we organize whole people, one of the things that happens is that people are connecting with folks through relationship building and strategy, right? The thing I loved hearing about, I think the New York Times ran an article that says, you know, Amazon beaten by two best friends or something like that, right? But the thing I loved about that article was that what you saw is a strategy of loving people, in that, you know, making food and having potlucks and bringing blankets and showing up to the bus stop and, you know, not just trying to say, sign this card, but saying like, I care about you. And I'm not working here right now, but I'm going to dedicate myself to doing this work because I care about you. And I know that if you win, we all win. And I do think that feeling, right, that's the type of stuff that gets people in as a lifestyle and it makes them stay, right? Those kinds of opportunities, when they present themselves, we have to be ready to be able to welcome people in with a culture that they feel like they belong, right? And that I think that's a big piece that we're seeing now too.
Great. Let's open it up to some questions from the audience and the online questions. Kim, I think we've got a few, it looks like, of ones online already. Do you want to do one of those first, and then we'll go to the in the room?
You want to go to people in the audience first? You want me to ask a question here?
Well, how about we'll start from the room. I saw Tammy's hand up first. Yeah. Do you want to kick us off?
Hi. So to the panel, first of all, I just got my book. I'm so excited. My students are going to be so excited to have this in the syllabus. So I've been listening to this and to Liz's comments, and at the end, my question is going to be, is this revolution? So you can start thinking about that now. But this is really a question about language, right? And I appreciate Smiley talking about newness in terms of mapping. But sometimes it bothers me when folks describe what's happening right now as new, or the kind of organizing as new, because from all of your origin stories, right? And you're shifting the storytelling in this book, right? To people who have long histories and cultures of organizing in this more full-bodied way, whole-bodied way, right? So I wonder if, for me, it's not so much that it's new organizing or that it's radical. It's radical because it comes from shifting who's creating the strategy table, what the strategy is. It's challenging IR questions about what is the labor movement, what do workers want. That's all radical, right? So I would describe this as radical, but also it seems revolutionary. And maybe that's why everybody's feeling some kind of way. And what I see in terms of revolution is this idea of participatory democracy and making the work site the primary place for political participation in a capitalist society, a neoliberal capitalist society, seems revolutionary, right? So when we read that this small group of folks in Staten Island gets a union at Amazon, everyone's like, whoa, because there's a little bit of revolution in that maybe. So that's the question to each of you. Is this revolution?
Sure. I mean, based on that definition, I love it. I mean, I think anytime that you try to push what seems radical one day to the center and make it mainstream, that can certainly be revolutionary, especially when you're talking about basic structures. And this is the thing that the right has done. It's like we're trying to change the rules. It's not just about any single issue. We can negotiate over issues all day. What we're trying to do is create a process where we can do that. and that the work site and collective bargaining, like Sarita said, is a site of that struggle, in addition to voting, in addition to other practices. And it's totally true. A lot of this is not new. We're just repopularizing it. And bargaining for the common good, historically, we could just say it was social justice unionism. Economic democracy, well, the fights that led to the New Deal weren't like, we want a New Deal and we want workers' rights and we want collective bargaining. They were, we want industrial democracy. And so, you know, this is certainly, I think we would be remiss to think that we were presenting ideas that were not in some ways buried deep inside of us from our own cultures and histories and understanding of things. I do think that we are on the cusp of something, and that it is threatening, because it's not just about reforming the way certain things are practiced, including labor law, but actually about completely changing them altogether in some ways. And that doesn't necessarily mean an either or. We aren't always trying to throw the baby out with the bathwater. There are certainly parts of the National Labor Relations Act that are fantastic that we want to expand on. But at the same time, we have this opportunity to build something different. And I'll just use one example and then pass the mic, is that, so someone asked me recently, you know, so what does it mean, right? Like with the Amazon workers, you've got the ALU in Staten Island, you've got RWDSU in Alabama, you've got the Teamsters, and you've got worker centers around the country like Warehouse Workers for Justice and AWUD, and you've got some groups organized in these small Facebook committees online and like different. So what does it mean to get to the table? And I said, well, I don't know. Which of you among us is going to be like Francis Perkins and create the new National Industrial Relations Board? I don't know. Clearly, this is not something that we could have predicted in 1935. So perhaps this would be the time for the administration to step in and create a new model for what this type of negotiation, what this type of democracy at Amazon could look like. And that's both totally intimidating and anxiety producing, but also perhaps liberating, exciting, and dare we say it, revolutionary.
I know there's lots of questions, so I will say ditto to everything Smiley just said, and just offer that I do think this is a moment of it. There's a huge invitation for radical imagination right now. And that's really what we tried to do in this book, to your point, is it's true. These are not new ideas. But sometimes the ideas were tried in the context that didn't quite give it the kind of wave or energy or air that it needed or oxygen that it needed. But we are in a different moment. And a lot of these strategies are taking root in a new and different way. And we're actually giving ourselves permission to have radical imagination around not only how we win, but what we demand. Which is really important, because in all my years, which is not many in relation, you know, in the greater labor history,
Don't try to roll it back.
but, you know, in my years in the labor movement, you know, my experience, and you talked about worker centers and the partnerships. I mean, when I started the worker center in Chicago, let me be clear, the labor movement was not happy with me that I started a day labor center. And in fact, I was raked over coals for that, right? And wow, it's evolved. Like, wow, it is amazing that these partnerships exist in the way that they do. But part of why they're existing and growing right now is because we're bringing this idea of radical imagination in and saying we're not just going to demand reform of the National Labor Relations Act, which is really important for sure. We're also going to demand a whole other set of things. And it's that bold imagination that we need right now that makes it revolutionary.
Yeah, and I just want to quickly say, I thought that it was really important in the book that there was a clear indication that collective bargaining matters, right? Collective bargaining at the workplace matters, and that actually the ability to do expanded bargaining really hinges on being able to protect that and expand it, right? Like, so one of the reasons why collective bargaining for so many people is an issue is because it's been a closed door for so many folks. And so the part about like bargaining for the common good and the ways of actually opening up these doors a little bit more and having it have more reach being important and also foundational that we can build on, I just feel like that is a critical thing. And I'm glad you mentioned it in the book, but we have to say. The other thing that I just want to make a point about is the way that you all engage gender and the importance of not only bringing that to the fore in terms of identity, but also having a gendered analysis and what that does, right? Like talking about, you coming up, both actually coming up through organizing as it relates to reproductive justice and that sort of thing. But it is, I have to, as a co-director of Will Empower, which is Women Innovating Labor Leadership, and also on the advisory council, and also our innovation fellow, our first fellow, that it matters that when you look at this book, it's mostly women, right? And it's mostly women of color on the cover. And so there is, when you say, is there a revolution? Yes, there is a revolution, because we are starting to both hear the stories, create platforms to hear what's going on with some of the folks who have been deeply marginalized. And what happens when we do that is, one, we create the opportunities, and we're now supporting the leadership of more women and women of color. And so we're seeing and hearing something different, and we're seeing a different style of leadership. And so when we have somebody who's thinking about like what it means to do this work for my grandbabies, for, a kid that might be in jail, for a parent that I'm trying to take care of, for church members, for a whole community on my back that I'm bringing into the room when I bargain or do whatever, right? We're having a very different conversation, and that is revolutionary.
Right. Let's maybe try and gather 2 or 3 questions together, and then we'll check them all out for the panel. Kim, do you want to give us a couple maybe from the online?
Yeah, absolutely.
disciplines?
There were a number of them, a lot of sort of practical questions. Christopher Thomas asked, what does intersectional organizing look like when trying to rally new shops? And how do we keep a Black feminist frame despite having gaps in the knowledge or staffing of our reps, organizers, and leaders? So this sort of intersectional organizing. And then the other question I would say, because you all have been talking about the Amazon Labor Union in Staten Island a lot, there's a number of questions here, but sort of like what happens next? And this might be a Liz question, but I'd love to hear what you guys think about this. Mike Kempsky says, Amazon will do everything it can to not bargain with the Amazon Labor Union. Are there plans amongst national unions to support ALU when they inevitably face the full force of Amazon delaying the bargaining? So those 2 questions.
Okay. Britt, do you want to, should we take those couple of questions to start?
Sure, unless I don't want them to
yeah.
standing. Yeah. We can hear one more.
How about we have one more from the in the room people? Yeah.
So thank you very much for all that you've presented on and discussed today. I have just as a matter of context, there was a lot of excitement with regards to the independent Amazon labor union. And then a couple of weeks later, Elon Musk puts in for $44 billion to buy Twitter. So when we talk about building power and we talk about what collective bargaining looks like as a tool in building power, how is that connecting to other efforts that are happening right now? So alongside the Great Resignation is also the Silver Tsunami, which is the unprecedented retirement of business owners who are baby boomers. How are we connecting like existing, and I do think it's still quite traditional, like it's a classic, right? Like collective bargaining and like, on-site labor organizing, but connecting that to other tools such as worker ownership and workplace democracy in that context, as well as the using the already existing economic power of unions through pension funds in order to actually facilitate that, use that leverage to like facilitate changes with the increasing amount of, for example, private equity landlords or business owners a la Toys R Us. What is the role that labor is doing to bring all these pieces together?
I'll give it a go. I won't answer everything perfectly, but and I hope you'll bring up the universal family care example in the Silver Tsunami. Okay, so I won't do that. I got you. You got me. Okay, all right. We got like a tag team over here. I think that there's a lot of things in the last comment and even some online, and so I'll speak to just a couple of them. The first one is that yes, all of these things are happening at the same time.
Yes, there is a national strategy, because we all know that even if Amazon were to like come to Jesus in the morning and be like, all right, we're going to come to the table with the ALU, that would still be a very lopsided negotiation. It would be very dangerous. And so there are movements, and that's why I say it's very unprecedented, because there are organizations across traditional and non-traditional organizations, unions, that are trying to figure out how to support workers around the country who are beginning to take action. And yes, simultaneously, then we have like the comptroller and the state treasurer here in New York and in other parts of the country calling on not just union pension funds, but some of our tax dollars that are invested in these big financial products and are invested in Amazon, to leverage that to really hold the company accountable in real ways. And so all of these are happening at once. I just want to clarify at the same time, movements are messy. They are messy as hell. I don't know how else to say it. Like at Jobs with Justice, I feel like, we have to be careful about how we put this on like a candidate interview questionnaire. But, one of the things we keep wanting to ask people is, how do you manage disappointment? Can you do resilience on a daily basis? Will you be okay? Okay, you can work here because it's messy, it's sloppy, and that's by design. But that's okay, right? That's how change is made, through that mess and that muck. And so I think it's really important for us to kind of keep remembering that and engaging it, even when perhaps we get disappointed or really challenged by the way certain actors may act or interact. And then I think the last thing I'll mention here is that there are organizations that are beginning to explore what it means to negotiate along some of these different conditions. We know that when workers have a say, when there's regular everyday people who are a part of governance on a daily basis, that the decisions are different. I mean, ask like any democracy-loving person in Russia right now, and they would probably tell you that, the less decision-making that workers have in unions or other forms of civil society, the more likely it is for authoritarianism and kind of right-wing populism to seep in. And we're also witnessing that in the US. I mean, our success, we feel like we're on the cusp of success, but it's not guaranteed. I mean, this is why I feel like I've been downing like antacids for like the last 6 weeks. I can be honest here. It's all, we're amongst family, right? Because like we have to actually make that happen. We have to, if we don't push at the same time to ensure that workers have everyday governance, like what we're doing with Amazon and these other companies, it will be too easy for the Elon Musks and the Jeff Bezoses and everyone to like just slip in and take control in ways that are really damaging. So I want to be honest about that. And just say that part of why we articulate so many different frameworks for collective bargaining, why we try to expand it beyond what is just between, a traditional employee and a traditional employer, is for reasons like this, to be able to tackle issues that may not be considered mandatory or permissible by the National Labor Relations Act, but to actually be able to discuss what it would mean to retire, and what's a platform for retirees to negotiate, and what is all of this, what could this look like in a new context. So there's changing the rules, and then there's implementation, and then there's the what we hope is the result of those things. And I won't pretend that I can predict what it will all look like, but I do know that when we center workers, we win.
Yeah, so I would just say part of what we're seeing is the need for multifaceted strategies right now. And we can't pigeonhole parts of our movement as doing one thing and one slice. I am a soccer player, and I often talk about like being on the field and being able to pass the ball and looking up. I used to coach my daughter's soccer team. And when you have 10 and 11-year-olds, you have to keep telling them to look up and pass the ball, right? And it's just like that. That's the moment we're in right now. So labor has amazing tools on capital strategies and how to leverage pension funds for an array of issues. And in my new capacity at the Ford Foundation, we're actually trying to get
we've helped support the building of a capital strategies hub where some of those tools can be extended to worker centers and the broader field of worker justice groups to think more expansively about how do you use worker pension funds to actually move the dial on policy demands in addition to organizing demands and much more. So there's an interdependence of these strategies, whether it's capital strategies, whether it's policy, whether it's organizing, but this siloing, and in some ways in the labor movement, in unions, the way that they're the different departments that never talk to each other, yet and as a result, we leave a lot of power on the table, right? We're not leveraging the full breadth of power that we have as workers. And that's, I think, part of the shift that we're starting to see happen that is so promising of how we're addressing, to your point, the many different issues that are playing out. And just to build on that, you mentioned the silver tsunami, and Smiley gave me a little nudge on that because it's a perfect example of, a sort of having an understanding, an analysis of what it means to be in the elder boom, right? I like to call it the elder boom versus silver tsunami for lots of reasons. But the elder boom, it creates a huge set of challenges for the labor movement and society as a whole, but it also creates an enormous amount of opportunity. And if we actually center, this goes back to intersectional organizing, my experience of co-founding Caring Across Generations with IGEN at the National Domestic Workers Alliance was all about placing domestic care workers at the center and saying, if we actually place them at the center of a strategy and we know and we have an analysis that the elder boom is coming, how do we bring together advocates across these movements to actually not just demand that we do better for domestic workers, but that we actually literally redesign our care infrastructure in this country, which is actually what's happening. Like there's actual conversation happening right now. But through it, let's not be naive. Domestic workers have also used that platform to organize for rights, from the Bill of Rights and standards around the country to creating standards boards where actually domestic workers are negotiating with industry leaders in the state or county or city, to now, for the first time ever, negotiating as a worker advocacy organization with a gig platform company, the Handy Agreement, which, by the way, they won what you would want in a union contract. $15 minimum wage to begin with, part-time off, like all the benefits that are way better than any of the state laws, but also a grievance process, the ability for workers to come together with managers. I mean, it's in Kentucky, Indiana, and Florida, okay? Not sites where there's tons of labor power right now. And so this is huge. This is what's possible when you do intersectional organizing. You open up new pathways, you open up new narratives, you open up different ways that people can see themselves and their interest and their stake in the fight. And that's what we want to push us as the labor movement to do more of.
Can I just say one of the things that is beautiful, though, is that you all talk about the washerwomen strike and the fact that it allows so many people to place themselves in a lineage, a long lineage. And so when we see and recognize this, my grandmother was a domestic worker. I never thought about her as a domestic worker, and I never thought about her as a part of something larger. But until I started reading about the washerwomen strike, and I was like, wait a minute, this is a big deal. And I want to speak to this piece around like, how do we do intersectional organizing and connect with organizers or what have you. Two pieces I will say. This weekend, we just did our emerging leaders cohort, and we had 27 women in the cohort. I'm so excited. Women and non-binary folk in the cohort. And so many of them, one, identified as children of immigrant or migrant farm workers, right? And I would say a significant number, children of single moms themselves, right? And that one of the things that you hear is that there's this hunger for being able to do organizing differently in a way that feels right to them And one of the things that happens when we actually bring an intersectional analysis to this kind of work, bring care to the center of how we do this work, is that we actually can invite and hold a diverse body of folk in organizing, because we burn out organizers because they we don't have a care ethic, and we can't envision how they actually are whole people too, and that in order to be able to make the kinds of connections that we know that having a diverse body of organizers do, that we actually have to see and value it, not just on paper, but in the ways that we do the work, right? And so that's one of the pieces I would say. But I also want to say that every day, the attention to accessibility in the language and the attention to what it means to give language for some of the stories that people have. Like when I finished my dissertation in 2012, I was out there like, we can't elect Mitt Romney. That's bank capital. You're about to put bank capital in the White House and private equity firms and stop. Yeah, everybody has to know this. But nobody knew what I was talking about. My professors didn't even know what I was talking about. Like they literally were like, whatever you say, private equity firms, haven't heard of them. But when you actually explain in the book and break down financialization and privatization, I know in some instances people will be like, I already know what this means. But so many people know what it feels like, but they don't have a word for it. And so one of the things that we do have to do is be connecting those dots and giving people the language that opens things up. And again, I think I just want to say that's the beauty of the book, because it respects people and it invites you to come in and to have the language to be able to say, this is happening to this person, and this person, different arenas, but it's the same thing. And so I just want to put that out there.
Well, we're running up at the end of our time now. However, as I think is evident, we're not at the end of a conversation. This book is sparking already a really great conversation. I think that's a sign of a successful book. It's not the final word. It gets you talking. And I think this is a really great book that I am going to encourage you all to buy the book. The Future We Need, ILR Press. It's for sale. Get your copy. Read the book. Encourage that too. But then I lastly just want to put on your syllabus for those of you who have that coercive power over your students. Put on your syllabus. But I do want to finish by just thanking both our two discussants, Sheree and Liz, their fascinating comments, and most of all, our two authors, Erica Smiley, Sarita Gupta. Fantastic book, and congratulations. Thanks everyone for joining us who is online. For the in-person people, we have some refreshments at the back, and let's keep talking.